In this episode, we connect an idea that sometimes feels like policy paperwork to something very concrete: the controls you choose and how you implement them. Data handling and marking requirements are the rules for how information must be treated based on what it is, where it can go, who can access it, how it must be stored and transmitted, how long it can be kept, and how it should be labeled so people do not accidentally mishandle it. If you get these requirements wrong or leave them vague, you can end up selecting controls that do not actually protect the data in the way the organization is obligated to protect it. If you get them right, control selection becomes clearer because you know what the data is allowed to do and what it is not allowed to do. The goal here is to help you identify data handling and marking requirements for your information types and show how those requirements drive control choices without becoming tool-specific or overly technical. By the end, you should be able to look at an information type and describe how it must be handled and labeled, and then explain how that directly shapes your security controls. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGRC.News in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Start with a plain definition of data handling, because the phrase can sound more complex than it is. Data handling is simply the set of rules and practices that govern the life cycle of information, including creation, collection, storage, use, sharing, transmission, retention, and disposal. Handling rules might say data can only be accessed by certain roles, can only be stored in approved environments, must be encrypted during transmission, must not be emailed externally, must be retained for a specific period, or must be destroyed in a specific way. Marking is how you label information so the rules are visible, such as labeling documents, records, or interfaces with a classification or sensitivity indicator. Marking is not security by itself, but it supports security by making expectations clear and reducing accidental misuse. Without marking, people are forced to guess how sensitive something is, and guessing is a common path to incidents. Together, handling and marking turn abstract sensitivity into practical behavior. A beginner-friendly way to think about why this drives control choices is to imagine that controls are the physical and procedural tools that enforce handling rules. If handling rules say only certain roles can see a data type, that drives access controls, role management, and access reviews. If handling rules say the data cannot leave the organization or must only be shared under certain conditions, that drives network boundaries, data loss prevention approaches, and third-party connection governance. If handling rules say the data must be retained for a specific period and then disposed, that drives retention controls, archival processes, and secure disposal practices. If handling rules require that the data be protected while moving, that drives secure communication requirements. So the handling rules are essentially the policy-level statement of what must happen, and the controls are how you make it actually happen. When you are selecting and tailoring controls, you should be able to point back to handling requirements as a primary driver, because they are often tied to legal obligations, contracts, or organizational policies. To identify handling and marking requirements, start from the information types you already identified and ask which ones have special sensitivity or special obligations. Personal information often has privacy-related handling constraints, like limits on sharing and retention. Financial information might have integrity and audit requirements that influence how it is stored and who can modify it. Authentication and security-related information like credentials, keys, and logs often have strict confidentiality and integrity needs because compromising them can undermine the entire system. Operationally critical information might have availability-driven handling expectations, like requiring backups, redundancy, or recovery testing. The goal is not to treat everything as the highest sensitivity. The goal is to identify which categories require distinct handling rules. If you treat everything the same, either you overspend or you create policy that people cannot realistically follow, and both outcomes tend to fail. Marking requirements usually come from organizational classification schemes, sensitivity labels, or sector-specific rules, and even when you do not name a particular scheme, the logic is still the same. Marking answers the question of how someone recognizes the required handling level at the moment they interact with the information. In practical terms, marking might appear in document headers, in metadata tags, in database field classifications, in application banners, or in export labels. The critical point is that marking should be consistent enough that users can learn it and apply it without constant supervision. If every team uses different labels, or if the same label means different things, marking becomes noise. Good marking is simple, clear, and aligned with the actual handling rules, because a label that does not correspond to real behavior teaches people to ignore labels. When you identify marking requirements, you are identifying how the organization communicates sensitivity and handling expectations. Handling requirements also include restrictions on where data can be processed and stored, which often shows up as an approved environment concept. Some information types might be allowed only in certain environments, like production systems, and prohibited from being copied into less controlled spaces like personal devices or unapproved testing environments. This matters because one of the most common real-world problems is data drifting into places it was never intended to go, like a developer copying production data into a test environment for convenience. Even if the developer is not malicious, that drift can violate handling rules and create new exposure. Controls that address environment restrictions might include access restrictions, segmentation, monitoring, and processes that govern data movement. Again, the point is not to name a tool. It is to recognize that handling rules like approved locations require enforcement mechanisms. If you do not translate those rules into controls, the rules remain aspirational and will be broken under pressure. Another major handling requirement category is transmission and sharing, which is about how data moves between components, to users, and to external parties. Some data can be shared broadly, some can be shared only with internal roles, and some can be shared externally only under strict conditions. These rules drive control choices like secure channels for transmission, restrictions on export functions, limitations on integrations, and monitoring of data flows. Sharing rules also intersect with privacy compliance, because personal information often has purpose limitations that affect who can receive it and why. It is important to keep security and privacy terms separate, but in the handling world, they meet as practical constraints. For example, a handling requirement might state that personal data can only be shared with approved service providers for defined purposes, which drives both contractual controls and technical controls that limit what data is sent and when. When you identify these requirements, you create a map of allowed paths for data, which is one of the most powerful drivers of control selection. Retention and disposal are handling requirements that beginners sometimes overlook because they do not feel like cybersecurity, but they absolutely influence risk. Keeping data longer than necessary increases the amount of data that could be exposed in an incident and increases the complexity of responding to requests like deletion or correction where applicable. Some information types must be retained for legal or operational reasons, and that creates availability and integrity implications because retained records must remain accessible and accurate over time. Other information types should be disposed of promptly, and that creates requirements for secure deletion or destruction. These rules drive controls like retention schedules, archival processes, access restrictions on archived data, and verification that disposal occurs. They also drive auditability, because organizations often need to prove that retention and disposal practices are followed. When you can tie retention rules directly to control needs, you show that handling requirements are not theoretical. They are operational expectations that must be enforced. Handling rules also often specify how information can be used and displayed, which connects to concepts like least privilege and need to know. For example, a handling requirement might say that only certain roles can view full identifiers, while other roles can view only partial or masked values. That drives control choices around role-based access, data masking, and user interface design decisions that limit exposure. Another handling rule might restrict printing, copying, or downloading of certain information types, which drives control choices around export controls and monitoring. In some environments, handling rules might require that certain documents carry a label when exported, which drives how reports are generated and tracked. The key is that handling requirements describe permissible behavior, and controls make that behavior enforceable and auditable. When you identify these requirements early, you avoid selecting controls that only protect storage while ignoring how users actually interact with data day to day. To keep this work defensible, you should treat handling and marking requirements as part of your traceability chain. You start with information types and security objectives. Then you identify handling rules and labels that apply to those information types. Then you show how those rules influence baseline tailoring and enhancement selection. If a handling rule requires restricted sharing, that becomes a driver for stronger boundary and monitoring controls. If marking is required, that becomes a driver for procedures and enforcement around labeling and training. If retention is defined, that becomes a driver for archival and disposal controls. This chain is what allows you to justify why certain controls were selected and why others were not. It also helps you explain decisions to stakeholders who might otherwise see controls as arbitrary. When people understand that controls exist to enforce specific handling obligations, they are more likely to support the effort because the controls become tied to real commitments and risk reduction. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify data handling and marking requirements for each major information type and explain how those requirements drive control choices in a clear, structured way. You understand that handling covers the full life cycle of information, including where it can live, how it can move, who can access it, how long it can be kept, and how it must be disposed. You understand that marking is how the organization communicates these rules so people can act correctly, and that inconsistent labels undermine compliance. Most importantly, you can connect handling requirements to controls, showing that controls are not arbitrary technical hurdles, but practical enforcement of defined obligations. When you do this well, control selection becomes more coherent, tailoring becomes easier to justify, and compliance becomes less about paperwork and more about making sure information is treated the way it must be treated.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.